Hello and welcome to what is possibly going to be my favourite podcast episode. It's going to be my favourite because normally I'm the one saying stuff which alienates and annoys members of my denomination. But this time it's not going to be me, it's going to be one of you two. And so I'm absolutely thrilled because we're going to be talking about something which is interesting and controversial. It is the Minister Greta Vosper, United Church minister, who is regularly termed the atheist minister. Whether or not that's true, we'll find out today from our esteemed experts. And Greta has been under investigation by the United Church for a while, and we're going to be discussing what the United Church should have done, what the United Church did, and what are the limits, if any, on ministerial responsibility to church doctrine. We are joined by Reverend Dr. Susan MacAlpine-Gillis and Reverend Dr. Ross Bartlett, two faculty members here at AST, and two experts in various ways on United Church theology, history, and polity. And so with that in mind, I want to hand it over to Ross, who might give us, because lots of people listening will be very familiar with this subject, and will have strong opinions, and will be ready to scold you from behind their headphones or screens. But others will be hearing the name Greta Vosper for the first time. Tell us about this exciting and very strange thing from outsiders' perspectives.
Okay, thank you, David. To make sense of what's happening, I think you have to separate her theological claims from what the church is investigating. The two are related because they're the same individual, but they are different, and we can talk about both. But to talk about the reason why she is most recently in the news, you may recall that in early January 2015, there was a horrible terror attack in Paris.
Yes.
And I can't remember the statistics, but it was a terror attack that shocked the world. In the aftermath of that, our moderator, the Reverend Gary Patterson, posted on the United Church website a prayer. It was not a particularly unusual prayer in terms of asking for the blessing of the Holy One on victims and their families and so on and so forth. It was a fairly routine thing for the leader of a Christian denomination to do. In the subsequent days, the Reverend Greta Vosper, who is a United Church minister in the West Hill congregation, which is in metropolitan Toronto, posted an open letter, and I don't know where it was originally posted, but it was picked up by various media outlets nationwide. And in that letter, she essentially called out the moderator for daring to invoke a supernatural or a non-terrestrial being. And I made some notes because I don't want to misrepresent her.
Of course, yeah.
So she says, if we maintain that our moral framework is dependent upon that supernatural being, we will allow others to do so, even if their choice and actions are radically different from our own. And then she says, ours is not a time when personal religious beliefs can be welcomed into the public sphere. So what she's basically saying, if you invert that, is that it's unjustifiable to introduce personal religious belief into the public sphere. Which is an interesting sort of conversation. The challenge that arose was that this was done in a public media way. And so a couple of congregations in Toronto Conference got wind of this and officially asked the Toronto Conference to investigate. Now you have to remember that Greta Vosper has been doing her theological thing for well over a decade, much longer.
What is your theological thing?
Well, let's finish one thing before I finish the other.
Yeah.
And so, and they complained, and so Toronto Conference initiated the investigation, as they were bound to, and so they were back and forth and to and fro, and part of it came down to the technical term is calling the church into disrepute through this public letter. Thank you. Anyway, the most recent part in this saga, which has gone on since 2015, is the rather terse announcement that West Hill United Church, Toronto Conference, and the Reverend Greta Vosper have settled their differences. End of story. Now, given that it's a personnel matter, it should be held in that way, but it leaves a really fertile ground for people to speculate on all sorts of things. So that's where she stands in terms of her relationship with the church. There are people who are suggesting that maybe there's another shoe to drop in all of this, that perhaps, I don't know, at some point she will simply retire quietly or something. We have no idea. That's pure speculation on my part.
Right. Now, you mentioned her theological thing. For listeners, viewers who may not be aware of her theological thing, what is that theological thing? Where she came from?
I by no means consider myself an expert on her theology. She labels herself as an atheist. She's self-labeled as an atheist and a minister. And my understanding is that most of the Christian convictions, I guess I would call them, around any sort of deity, any sort of deity are illogical throwbacks. Okay. And that religion really cannot be redeemed. It has to be cleansed of this commitment to some sort of other.
Right. Gotcha. One of the things that strikes me about the quote that you read, because I had heard about atheist minister, and I'd assumed that it was, similar to Thomas Althusser in the 60s with the Death of God movement, or similar figures, the Overbecks in the 1890s. But that sounded much more like a sort of a Richard Dawkins style atheism than these kind of atheisms. The assumption being that if one bases one's moral positions on a deity, then Muslims who were responsible for the Charlie Hebdo attacks do the same thing, and therefore you're green lighting it. Assuming that there is another non-faith based perspective that one could base it on, some universal good or something called human rights that might be defensible by reason. So it seems to be a very Dawkins style atheism rather than a sort of the kind of theological atheism that was very popular in the 1890s and again in the 60s.
No, I think you're quite right there. From everything that I've read of hers and can gather, she is responding to a particular image of God that she does not like, and laying it on the rest of the United Church to maintain that when we say God, we mean what she says, and therefore we should not say God, we should not believe in God because it means what she says it means. The irony being that what she says we are saying God means, I haven't seen in the United Church in a long time. And so in one sense, she's created this straw figure against which she tilts. But of course, when we use the language of God, it allows of all sorts of interpretations.
Right. Susan, have you heard over the years any mutterings? Because unlike the vast majority of us, she is a religious figure who the secular press report on. So presumably people in the pews would actually have heard about her. And what kind of views are out there? If you had to draw a picture for the listeners, viewers, of the topography of perspectives on Greta Vosper, what would you say?
Well, I think there's a wide range of views. I mean, I've had conversations. Greta pops up in the media on a fairly regular basis. Right. And the good thing about that is that it opens up the opportunity for good theological conversation. Right. Because if Greta were to, as Greta proclaims herself to be an atheist, well, we could talk about that. What does that mean? If being a theist means that I have to believe in a male sort of God figure sitting on a throne in heaven, long beard, Santa-like dictating, if I'm good and pray enough, God will give me what I believe. Well, I don't think that, that's not my understanding or the image of God. So it leads to lots of good conversations. I think that for the vast majority of folks in the United Church, many have moved beyond that kind of theistic understanding of God to something that is much more immanent. And so it's people in the United Church that I've spoken to get a little upset when a minister who says there is no God is given a lot of press. Right. And until you have the opportunity to unpack what that means, and often in CBC sound bites, you don't. Right. And I think that Greta intentionally is being provocative in order to expand the conversation. Right. At least that's what I want to believe. And certainly in the United Church, we talk about having a very large theological tent. Right. My personal concern is that at some point, is it possible to move beyond what is the tent of a Christian church?
Right. And that, I think, I really want that to be our focus in the second half of our conversation. That's a really, and I don't know, and I'm sure our tents might look a little bit different as time goes on. But I'm really interested in this. So the positive aspect that you're emphasizing is that I think you and probably Greta Vosper are correct that far too many Christians in the pews perhaps do imagine God in a very anthropomorphic way as a male superhuman figure. Right. You think of the language of this supreme being, so just like us except cooler, and that she is looking to to challenge that and to overthrow that. And I would also very much agree, with you, Ross, when you said that that's not a position that officially we've had for a very long time. I don't think it's the God of Aquinas, I think it's the God of Luther or Calvin. And so I'm not sure that we ever had that, although I'm sure we often slid into that problematically.
It's dominant in culture.
Yeah. It tends to be. And so again, as you say, at the very least, this creates a space for conversation. And do people in the pews get that and see that, or is it simply, God, I wish she'd shut up?
Well, like Susan, there's a wide range. I mean, there are those who she labels herself a progressive. The folk that I know, both lay and clergy, who I think are genuinely progressive Christians, have moved way beyond. It's a very modernistic sort of view of the way the world works. It elevates science and what we can prove, and what can't be proven obviously is fictional. And so that's very modernistic, and in some ways it's quite tired. And but then there are the other people who wonder about somebody using the position of an ordained minister of the United Church of Canada, who by virtue of office has a certain level of authority in matters of faith, proclaiming a faith which is so markedly different than anything you would find in any of our theological statements. And you can find a lot of stuff in our theological statements. And the other thing is, there are certain acts of the church that she has declined to conduct. For example, baptism is no longer held at West Hill United Church.
Or communion.
I don't think they hold communion either. And so many of the people in the pew just sort of wonder about the rules of the game. If you can redefine the role, if you can redefine the actions of the church in your image, then what is stable? And I think it has to be said quite clearly that for many people, it's not so much the theology. We could talk about the theology, but I know many fine Unitarians who would be quite happy with what I understand she's saying.
Except that I've heard Unitarians say no, because Unitarians gather people together and talk about respect for all aspects of the divine. And
Yeah.
so if Greta's saying there is no divine, then you couldn't be a Unitarian either.
Okay, that's helpful to hear that. But a lot of the questions that I hear have to do with her using the position that she has to espouse a view that is so radically at odds.
Yeah. There's a question, and that, again, I think we're definitely moving towards that really interesting conversation. But before then, she mentioned a few times that she can't possibly be critiqued by the church for implementing what she's learned in seminary. And it seems to me that it does have certain things to say to us about seminary formation when a very, as you say, the faith-reason dichotomy is something which abounded in the 1890s, and a sort of philosophy largely does away with it, and theology definitely, but it bubbles back up in new atheism. How has seminary not nuanced that? How has seminary fueled that rather than nuanced it?
Well, I have to say that, as far as I know, I was trained in the same seminary that she was, and with many of the same professors.
What seminary is this?
Queen's.
This is Queen's, okay.
Which no longer exists as a United Church Theological School. I think that's where she was trained. And I never encountered that. I mean, I never really encountered that in Sunday school growing up.
Yeah.
And so to say that she received this in seminary, I don't understand how she could have received that as a dominant position in any United Church seminary. I just don't know. I mean, other than as a possible model for conversation about where we were and where we are not now, but I can't. I really struggle with the notion that would be taught as a credible theological position in area.
But would she have? I had a very eye-opening experience when I gave a workshop. I think it was in PEI, and there were a lot of retired or retiring ministers there. And my workshop didn't go over very well because it was on capitalism, and I was kind of trying to sort of push the notion that there were resources within Christianity which could, resist and provide spaces of revolution against materialist capitalism and stuff like that.
Sounds interesting.
That was my hope, but the people there really just had no interest in it because, from their perspective, Christianity on the whole was a malign thing. That pick any of the main problems, be it racism, be it environmental catastrophe, be it nationalism, whatever, it's largely Christianity's fault. And there was that sense of just great despair that their life had been in the service of something which is largely malign, Is there a danger that in the 80s and the 90s and the 70s that we did flag, quite rightly, Christian complicity in horrors and an acknowledgement of how Christianity failed to offer resistance against blah, blah, blah. And in so doing, we created a space where perhaps less subtle minds could have seen a causal relationship. So, for example, students do it occasionally, and you sort of tell them, well, you might want to nuance that, which is, you find something misogynistic in the Bible, and so straight away the image is that you have the age of Aquarius, no misogyny, and then someone writes this and everyone said, oh, we're all misogynists now. And there's that wonderful, I don't know if you watch Father Ted at all.
Oh yeah, on occasion.
But there's that line with this guy outside, and Father Ted has said something or done something racist, and he says, "Oh, so are we all being racist now, Father?" And he's a kind of so that's the line in the sand. Now we're all racist, with the assumption that before the Bible said something misogynistic. Misogyny wasn't a thing,
Right.
you know, that it had to be invented. And so instead of, you know, why does Scripture not offer more resources against this? And yes, it does offer some, but this is still a problematic element that we've got to engage with. It establishes this as the cause, you know, and that seems to be a fairly widespread perspective. And so maybe Greta Vosper, she seems to think that religion, at least in that quote, is the source. Again, this is William Kavanagh's Myth of Religious Violence, I think, does a good job in blowing this up like an atomic bomb. But the idea that religion is the cause of all evil in the world, is that something that maybe in seminary, I don't know, where did you do your studies?
I did mine right here.
Right here. And so was that a factor here?
So
Was
no, I mean, I think there are a couple of things that I recall directly. And I came into seminary very young, straight out of high school, university, and here. So for me, my mind was open to a lot of new things here, but liberation theology was very, very critical. So reading Scripture with that sort of eye for the preferential option for the poor was very high. The other piece for me that kind of expanded my whole understanding of that which is divine was the whole learning all about sort of panentheism, that the God in whom we live and move and have our being, which for me was absolutely diametrically opposed to the God I had been exposed to in my congregation of St. James, where every Sunday morning one sang, "Holy, holy, holy, Lord God Almighty." You know, there was a very classic Trinitarian understanding of God. It was very male-oriented. I can remember, you know, deep conversations with people my own age. I was clearly a nerdy kid because I'm having conversations about the fact that God is not male, right? You know, I mean, those are the age of conversations about inclusive language, about moving beyond metaphor. So
an exciting time.
Well, it was a very exciting, and it was a very difficult time in the life of the church. The role of women in the church, the battles around language, about expanding the image of God beyond Father, that God was beyond gender, that gender or, you know, metaphor allowed us to understand aspects of God who is beyond mystery and knowledge, I think is part of the Song of Faith. So some of what Greta talked about, at least in her early years, was like, okay, sure, that's where we are. And I think that certainly the people that I preached to for 26 years were given a much more expansive understanding of that which is other than us. But I think in the response that Greta made to the prayer from the moderator was certainly trying to draw that attention that if we as Christians believe we can call upon our people to pray to this God who is other than us, then those who are of other faiths can do the same for maybe more nefarious reasons.
Well, there was there seems in that letter to be an equation between one sort of action, prayer, and another sort of action, a violent terror attack, as if there's no separation, there's no nuancing between the two. And I was in seminary slightly before Susan, and in my time, it was Douglas John Hall talking about the end of Christendom, and very aware of the multiplicity of errors and sins that can be laid at the feet of the church. No hiding from that, and recognizing that attempts were being made to rectify that. And it occurs to me that, again, this language, you use the word God, and I really don't know what you're thinking when you use the word God until you tell me. And I do know that in my congregations that I've served, sometimes people use very traditional language because it's the only language they have.
Right.
They will pray to God Father because that's the language that they've learned to use for God, but it doesn't have the anthropomorphic connections that we would attach to Father.
Right.
It's the language that they have, and so.
And it's deeply embedded.
It's deeply embedded. It's deeply embedded language. The content of which has changed quite radically. So that if you were to sit them down and ask them, well, who is this God that you are calling Father? It would be much more expansive than the narrow male long beard, throwing thunderbolts if I'm mixing my religions, you know, that sort of stuff. And so it seems to me
it's that gray-haired and bearded guy, right?
Yeah, the thunderbolts are in the closet. Yeah. So but it just seems to me that, yes, if you go around to United Churches, you will still hear the God language. You may still hear the Father language. You may certainly find a degree of patriarchy, probably no greater a degree of patriarchy than would be found in Canadian society in general, and in many cases less. And so I would argue in the case of the church that a tremendous amount of work has been done on that. We have been training ministers in a way that pushes back against some of that negative baggage, but also reclaims some of the good. The idea that religion is the cause of all evil, I mean, it's as old as the French Revolution. But you don't need religion to cause war. And the notion that if we were without religion, we wouldn't have a Hitler or a Stalin or a Pol Pot or an Idi Amin or a Robert Mugabe is just foolish.
Yes.
Right.
And so there's I will say, Greta has a wonderful eye for publicity, and maybe she has a publicist that does this well, and she knows how to get her message out there in a fairly simple, direct, straightforward. Unfortunately, it's not necessarily helpful because it just simply shuts things down.
One thing which troubles me a little bit, or not necessarily trouble me, but I wonder about it. Cue boring analogy, but within Roman Catholicism, one of the pathologies that has affected us at various times is equating the church with the good. You know, and again, this is what Luther and many others tried to take a sledgehammer to. But when we do that, then any critique of the church must by definition be bad, because it's in opposition to the good.
Right, yeah.
And so therefore the church loses the capacity for self-reflection, for self-criticism, and so on and so forth. I wonder if there is a theological trajectory which understands progress as itself the good. And that is, by progress I mean movement away from the past, right? Whatever that looks like. And therefore, if that is identified as the good, then we've got to keep moving. And so ultimately it becomes parasitic. And so, you know, whereas today we would say, you know, we all would, you know, agree that it's sort of, you know, genderist and determined by biology, etc. And so we would then, you know, affirm that. But for those who equate the good not with that identification but with progress itself, therefore we must move on to the next tale, which is that species is not determined by, you know, by biology, or you know, or whatever, and then we've got to keep on moving, and ultimately it sort of becomes parasitic upon itself. Is there a sense, as some people have suggested, that there is a natural trajectory within liberal Christianity? Again, so, you know, the United Church is a very, very broad tent, and so I wouldn't necessarily say the United Church is the poster child for liberal Christianity. But there are certain elements which may see the kind of moves that Schleiermacher and others make as, you know, as antecedent in terms of identity. Is there a trajectory where this inevitably must keep moving towards an absolute secularity, which is now championed by Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, and Greta Vosper? You know, is that a sense that, or whither progressive Christianity is one of the questions I have. Some people would suggest that it naturally just hemorrhages out until it becomes part of the social framework, because those things which would stop that hemorrhage, the Bible, or you know, some kind of, you know, blind adherence to tradition, have naturally been moved away in terms of their authorities. So how without authorities does this natural slide be averted?
I think the question of authority is one that's really interesting, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think, it is an interesting question, and it's certainly across the trajectory of the history of the United Church, there is a constant movement towards what is usually called progress, involving the roles of women, the nature of the whole economic system, the whole social gospel thing. The temperance movement, trying to deal with an incredibly huge problem of alcoholism. Issues around war, sexual orientation, and so on and so on. We have a group of people who have been very faithful in calling us to see how the gospel actually lives out in the world.
Yes.
And so they try and call us away from a sort of privatistic pietism. But on the other hand, we live in a highly individualistic society. And so when people read the Bible and Paul says you, they read it you singular when he may very well have been talking about you plural. And so because the United Church, probably more than most of the churches in Canada, is very much a product of and part of the society in which we live, we are very much impacted by those social movements. Many of the people that I know of and respect and admire who would identify themselves as progressives would see themselves as not trying to get rid of the faith, but trying to remove even those barriers which make it difficult for people to encounter the holy. I'm sufficiently confused about the labels myself that in the spring I'm for the formation class, I'm having 3 of my colleagues who identify as progressive, traditional, and middle of the road come in and speak to them about what that means in their pastoral practice, because these are terms that move around very fluidly, and somebody's progressive is somebody else's heretic, is somebody else's stick in the mud. So like the terms are very, very fluid. And so, yeah, there is a possibility that we lose any and all Christian distinctiveness, but that doesn't necessarily have to happen.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting in terms of the big wide tent of the United Church that, you know, we still have enough autonomy within individual congregations within the United Church to espouse a particular theological perspective, and those who are drawn to that are going to be part of that faith community. So, I mean, I have no issues with what happens in many ways in West Hill with Greta, you know, fine folk doing good work. If we talk about sort of love as being kind of central to who Christ calls us to be, and to manifest that love in acts of care and compassion in the world, from what I understand, Greta's congregation does that nicely. You know, my ever so brief interactions with Greta would say that she is a lovely woman, kind, well-spoken, methodical, caring, compassionate, loved by the people that she serves within her congregation. But for me, it's still that question of, to be a minister in the United Church of Canada, which is a Christian denomination, are there some limits to what that means?
Well, that
right.
Well, let me try and put you on the spot, because I won't be happy until one of you alienates some of the people listening. I want to get
we haven't done that yet. Okay.
You know, because I want to get out of the hot seat. So let's say on one extreme, you have someone like me.
Are you an extremist, David?
Like, one of my dream jobs would be the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, who would basically go around finding people who got a missing iota on a letter and say, "You got out of this place," you know, like you know, following around Pope Francis, and you know, last April he said that people can enjoy the beatific vision without professing the filioque. just clear your desk, leave your keys in heaven with the guard on the way out. You're out of here, Frankie. I joke, but with someone like that who would just be completely doctrinaire.
Right.
Now, we'd all say that that's, well, I mightn't say that, but most rational people would say you don't want that.
Right.
Now, on the other extreme, you would have, Johnny showing up here at AST and saying, I want to be on a church minister. I don't want to be put in a box. I don't want to put God in a box. And for me, the best way of thinking about God is as Satan. And I'm a committed Satanist. And so I want to set up a United Church of Canada, but we'll be, using satanic language because it's more in keeping with, 21st century mores. That we shy away from too, I would suspect. So, Susan, the impossible question, and I when I say put you on the spot, I don't mean like no one can say, okay, here exactly.
I'm glad it's you.
It'll come to you in a second. It's moving away. Are you happy with? Are you comfortable with Greta Vosper as a United Church minister? The church using its funds to support her in her ministry, her potentially having the care of souls who seek out a Christian congregation and may go, oh boy, I haven't been here in a long time, I see it's changed, oh well. Is that okay? And if so, where would the line be drawn? Or if not, where have you drawn the line? What kind of things?
Thanks, David.
I know it's a nightmare question. I apologize. It really is.
So, it is. It's a really tough question because I do consider myself, in terms of the progressive spectrum, to be more, progressive than not. Mm-hmm. But my issue really is when one, as a minister of the United Church of Canada, can say, actually, I do not believe that there is a God. There is nothing, there is no divine, there is no other beyond myself. Right. That for me is the line.
Okay.
You can describe the other as mysterious, as beyond knowing, as a cloud of, mystery. You can define that other in any number of ways, and I would be happy with that and say, yep, that's still... And some recognition that Jesus lived, walked, and had a profound effect on those first followers. Right. We can argue about your understanding of resurrection. Bill Phipps got into lots of trouble years ago when he said, there was no bodily resurrection of Jesus or something to that effect. And I remember conversations with my mother around that. That was interesting. So we can talk about that. But I guess my bottom line, and for me, you've kind of moved beyond the tent peg of the United Church when you say there is no other beyond me.
Okay.
So prayer becomes, we pray to ourselves or for ourselves. Yeah. There is no kind of mystery or, for me, the movement of the Holy Spirit happens in ways that I cannot define, but I choose to believe, and I have experience that tells me there is something beyond what I can see. That's
very helpful, and it's very clear. What I'm hearing you say is that, there is massive breadth in what theological options could be embodied, as long as they're theological options. When they cease to be theological and start to be something else, then by definition they are non-theological and they are something else.
Right.
Ross, you'd agree with that, would you? And is that where you would draw the line?
I would agree. We don't have a congregation for the doctrine of the faith in the United Church. Sometimes I wish we should.
Exactly.
We'll talk. We'll talk. And we don't have a tradition of being heresy hunters.
No.
Things arise, issues arise, people are brought to the fore, usually in relationship to what is called effectiveness in ministry. And like Susan, the denial of the possibility of any existence of an other moves beyond the tent peg. It's not to say that the person who holds that is bad or going to hell or is going to get zapped by a thunderbolt or whatever metaphor. We're not saying that. It's simply to say, and the United Church has certainly ever since, I guess, the 1940 Statement of Faith, has not said that people who believe other than we do are necessarily damned.
Right.
We are not a particularly strong conversionist crew. But when we are ordained and when we enter into a covenant with a congregation to be in ministry, we make promises. We make promises at ordination about belief in God in a triune expression, and we make promises about offering or proclaiming the gospel within the beliefs and practices of the United Church of Christ, United Church of Canada. That's not a quotation, but that's basically what we do. That at ordination, and we do that every time we are covenanted into leadership with a congregation. And so the problem that I have is when somebody and there's all sorts of room for internal struggle and debate, and I mean
essential agreement.
We talk about essential agreement, which is pretty broad, and we have 4 foundational statements of faith, and it's a pretty wide swath to find. But it does include a deity. It does include a Trinitarian approach to the faith in some way or shape or form, and so to declare oneself an atheist and to declare oneself an atheist United Church minister is something of an oxymoron. And well, from what I gather from friends in that presbytery from years back, there's been a sort of, shall we call it, a circulation of the saints, that the people who we would identify as Trinitarian, Christian, whatever they would call themselves, have moved to places that are more congenial, and West Hill has become a community of folk who are sort of shaped in Greta's image. And I would agree with all the affirmative comments about them that Susan made. It's really not about what you believe, and it's not about the fact that you're nasty people. It's about the fact that the tent does have boundaries. It's pretty wide, but it does have boundaries, and particularly if you're going to present yourself as a representative. Susan and I have been in congregations where there was the whole range of belief. We can be marvelously accommodating. We don't fight with one another about things like that usually.
Most of the time.
But when one is a representative, and one of our understandings of ministry is to be a representative person, representative of the church, and to be so fully antithetical to what the church claims to believe, even in all of its broadness, that to me takes us into ethical issues of integrity, and that's what the investigation by Toronto Conference was about. It wasn't about the theology as such. It was about the effectiveness of a minister who is publicly espousing beliefs that are contrary to the broad range of United Church conviction.
What was the range of options that the investigators, I want to call them inquisitors.
No, please don't do that, David.
We had enough
people talking about this as a heresy trial, and which it really was not. And I do understand just from a bit of reading that at the time of Greta's ordination, I'm not sure what her ordination vows actually were, because apparently there was some movement within that conference that allowed for more flexibility in ordination vows.
They were still Trinitarian. They were still Trinitarian vows. They may have been God, who we know as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, or Redeemer, Sustainer, Creator.
Right, so they may have been more broadly
They may have been more broadly phrased, but they were still Trinitarian vows. So
I'm sure that West Hill, because it's famous, because it's a sort of in the media eye and it's cool, I'm sure it attracts a lot of people. I'm sure it's
not a very large congregation, as I understand it.
Right.
I've never been in it.
It's not as congregations go. It's not particularly large. It certainly is in the media, and certainly there's every reason to believe that they love their minister, and rightly so. There's clearly a warm relationship there, but is it a United Church of Canada congregation? And so you were asking about the options that the inquisitors, your word, not mine, that could have taken. Well, they could have done everything from, and this is where we're in behind the veil of the privacy of a personnel issue.
Right.
There could have been any number of forms of discipline, up to and including being placed on the discontinued service list, which is our version of being defrocked, in other words, being stripped of function and status as a United Church minister. There could be any form of remedial type work, study, counseling, the list goes on and on. There could be something involving the congregation in terms of discipline. Or there could be, nothing here, and a lot of smoke, no fire, and away we go. So, there's a whole range.
Is that what happened? Some of the media reports seem to indicate that it was a lot of smoke, no fire, carry on, all good.
Well, some of the media reports say that, but I'm intrigued by the fact that I haven't heard...
Apologies to our listeners. This is one of the... we'll just kill that. Okay.
I haven't seen a whole...
God calling?
A whole... there. I haven't seen a whole lot in the media which would have said that it's, go away, you're okay. I mean, you'd think there would have been more of a celebration of the victory over the tyranny of the church. So that's why I think that there's something more there. I don't know what the more is, and whatever I speculate it will be, it will probably be something very different. But I think there's something more going on there. And that often happens in personnel issues. It happens in the non-disclosure agreements are common in those sorts of things.
One of the students, I essentially overheard a student conversation the other day, and then I found myself within it while not saying anything, because again, I love being able to say, hey, this is a really interesting issue and it's nothing to do with me.
That's a Roman Catholic. When you listen to you implode in your church.
Yes, exactly it. And the point she was making was that, in her opinion, could be wrong, she noticed an age distinction in that younger people were more angry at Greta Vosper and the theology she represented than older people. And afterwards I was trying to think, why would this be? And the only thing I could have kind of come up with is the idea that so many young people like the idea of revolution. They like the idea of changing the world. And there's a sense in which the kind of theology that Greta represents is so perfectly harmonized with what the world would like a good Christian to be, that essentially they will...
A good Christian without Christ.
A good Christian without Christ, exactly. That they will agree with everything that sort of secular liberal democracy says by and large, that they will promote the things that we can all agree are good with. And if you had a sort of a mission statement from Google or Apple or TELUS or most of our governments, it would be pretty much the kind of perspective that we have from Greta Vosper's perspective. And so if you're largely entirely on the side of Google, Apple, Microsoft, TELUS, big business, and we say Justin Trudeau, that is government, if you're on the side of business and government, it's very hard to be revolutionary or rebellious. And so maybe there was something in that. I don't know. But do you see a distinction with younger people or?
Yeah, I do. I would take it in a very different way. I would say that for much of our history, the United Church, because we've been the official church without the status, but we've been tied in with government and schools and so on for so long, that we've in fact it traditionally sort of lowered those distinctions, and so we made Christianity into being a good citizen with an hour on Sunday. My sense is that many of the younger people who care enough to identify with that would be angry because they would be angry at their faith. Will you please answer that?
Who really wants to talk to you?
This is my daughter's laptop, and so I suspect that my daughter is, and I have no idea how to stop this, which is problematic too.
I didn't know this was a call-in show.
Apparently, yeah, that might be cool.
Yes.
So I think we're still alive, just about.
Okay.
Okay, continue.
Right.
Somebody really
Just
wants to
justify this.
FaceTime with you.
Yeah. Where was I? So I think it may be that their anger with Greta is the whole business of calling oneself something that I identify with. I had to make a choice. A lot of my peers do not. They may even mock my choice. And here she is calling herself one of us in this bland, pablum, no radicality at all sort of way. That would be another way of taking that.
Yeah, I think that probably makes a lot of sense. And so, what does the future hold in two ways? Do you think for Greta Vosper and her congregation, and two? And I'll ask this to both of you, and we can wrap up with these two questions. One, the future vis-a-vis Greta individually, and then more generally, do you see a theological trajectory among students coming into ministry, either in keeping with the trajectory that Greta is on, or in opposition to it?
I think our students that I encounter, I think are present as wide a variety as the United Church does.
Yeah.
So, I think part of the concern raised among students and United Church ministers who would see themselves on the more progressive side of the theological spectrum talked about their concern that, is somebody going to interrogate me about my beliefs? Am I somehow going to be put on trial for not subscribing to a particular doctrine? Frankly, I think that's a bit of a straw.
Well, yeah, not unless you call out the moderator on public media.
Right. So, and I think, not that I'm necessarily espousing for a, don't tell kind of theory, but nobody would have given much, if any, notice of what Greta Vosper and West Hill were about if the congregation was happy with her ministry and nobody from within the congregation was raising a concern about her doctrine or her way of being. They simply would have gone on their way as a United Church that maybe others in the neighborhood would have said, well, that's pretty, progressive. It's not my style, but if it works for them, that's fine. The issue is when you, draw so much attention and when I think you are intentionally provocative.
Yes.
Right? So I think for some of our students that I've had conversation with, some of them are very upset about the fact that they are and have discerned a call into the United Church where they feel at home, where all of a sudden it is now okay to not believe in God, in any kind of God, and you can still be a minister. I think many of them kind of hold to the same place that I put the tent peg. And that's very disconcerting. And I think it's disconcerting for any number of people in the vast majority of our congregations who may identify God in a whole variety of ways, but would still identify with some notion of God as beyond.
As you were speaking earlier on about your tent peg, I was thinking a lot of people in the other church, have problems with the Song of Faith. Personally, I think it's great.
I think it's beautiful
because it does capture all those core creedal things, and yet at the same time provide space for us to interpret them in various ways. Right. But it seems that is the kind of created, flourishing small O orthodoxy, which is sort of which provides the grammar for the ecclesia, and without that, because that's good and broad.
It is.
And, it's not asking a huge amount.
No,
No.
exactly.
Not from a doctrinal kind of orthodoxy.
Exactly.
piece. I mean, when the new creed was developed in 1960 something, we still call it the new creed. I mean, that was considered rather revolutionary to move away from the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed and to go, okay, we're looking at something that's broader, and even in it. We are not alone.
Yeah.
We live in God's world.
That's right.
Well, I don't know that Greta lives in God's world anymore.
Right.
Greta lives in the world, but I don't see any reference to anything that is of God.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And Ross, do you have anything
I
you're nodding away there?
I would say, again, I will be interested to see what happens down the road in terms of the other shoe dropping around this sealed agreement. I mean, I don't imagine, as Susan says, if one did not intentionally draw attention to oneself by being controversial, everybody would be sort of prepared to live and let live until somebody in the congregation raises a complaint. Everybody's happy to live and let live. So to say, well, people, this is my phrasing, people are picking on us because of what we believe. No, they're talking to you because you forced the conversation. We didn't want to have it, but you forced the conversation. In terms of our students, it's interesting the number of our students who can recount some sort of, I guess the broad technical term would be mystical experience in their encounter with the holy. But there's a clear belief that there is a holy. How we talk about that holy is a subject of rich and fruitful debate, but I don't see a lot of people following that road, and I think that for colleagues or students or people who are worried about the long arm of the holy law coming after them,
I don't think so.
There's just no precedent. There's no resources. I mean, in the United Church, most of the folk who do these things are volunteers, and they're not going to go looking for problems until problems present themselves.
Yeah.
So we don't go hunting for this sort of stuff. She's just, quite frankly, she would not have very much, if any, following within the broader United Church if she was not picked up and regularly trotted out by the media.
Right. Which speaks to her
Her capacity. She's wonderful.
For PR.
She's got that. She's got that down pat.
And you were saying, Susan, she's tremendous interpersonal skills, which
Yes.
are
Yes.
positive. So
Yes,
she
very
obviously
much
has,
so.
has a number of gifts.
Oh yeah, there's no question that she's gifted and creative. In fact, I use one of her talks. I don't call them sermons. I use one of her talks when I teach preaching, a video of that with our students, because she is very good at
Very engaging.
articulating what she believes, and I'm trying to make the distinction between watch how it's done and then pay attention to what's said, because the two can be separated. So yeah, I have respect for her in many ways. I just don't think what she's saying is really all that exciting. It's certainly not that novel. And
Excellent. Ross and Susan, thank you both so very, very much for this fascinating conversation on Greta Vosper. And to you, the viewers and the listeners, apologies for us being interrupted by my laptop. And thank you very much for joining us. And please do spread the word. All complaints can be addressed to Reverend Dr. Susan MacAlpine-Gillis and Reverend Dr. Ross Bartlett. And for this week, you can leave me out of it. Thank you very much. Again, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, guys.
Thanks,
you,
David.
David.